morning, everyone. Thank you for your coming for this presidential plenary. So my name is Sari Hanafi. Let me start by acknowledging of country. The place known as Australia comprises the traditional states of over 250 First Nation language group. For nearly 50 years now, Australia have increasingly formally recognized the importance of country and the First Nation peoples' relationships and protocols for conducting business in country. Acknowledging country shows respect for the country and the First Nations' continuing connection to country. TASA and ISA 2023 World Congress to wish the cultural protocols to be known to all and observed. The country we meet on this World Congress is called Narem, and it is the home of Kulin Nation, Wurundjeri, Wawaranga people. So, with this note, I would like to go to our panel. Liberalism, the other, and religion. In the age of authoritarianism and populism, many argue that the political liberal project is in danger. Is this related to the conceptualization or to its application? How would this project encompass more comprehensive social justice, social love, convivialism, solidarity, and all forms of pluralism? Is secularism a mechanism to achieve the political liberal ideal or a value in itself? By distinguishing between conception of justice and the public reason versus the conception of a good life, how can Rawlsian political liberalism be more comprehensive in conceptualizing individual autonomy, freedom, and equality? How public reason can reasonably accommodate different repertoires of moral arguments? And finally, beyond criticizing the social life and market and all forms of domination, should sociology construct a framework for society? So I will invite the panelists to reflect on that. So I am honored to have 4 speakers, 2 philosophers, and 2 sociologists. So like the order of science, we start by philosophy and then we go on to sociology. So this is, I put it. So we will start by Cécile Laborde, Minimal Secularism Defense. So Cécile Laborde she is a professor of political theory at the University of Oxford and a fellow of the British Academy. She has published widely on theory of law and state, pluralism, syndicalism, and contemporary theories of nation, toleration, republicanism, multiculturalism, secularism, and global justice. She is notably an author of pluralist thought and the state in Britain and France. So, can you please put the pre-recorded? Yeah.
I'm sorry not to be able to join you in person, but I'm very grateful to the organizers, particularly Sari Hanafi, for the invitation to give this talk. My topic is, should the liberal state be secular? Does liberalism demand strict separation between state and religion? The issue is not merely a theoretical one. Most Western states are secular states, even as they accommodate various forms of religious establishment or exemptions for religious believers. Yet the great majority of people in the world live under regimes that are either constitutional theocracies, where religion is formally enshrined in the state, or regimes where religious affiliation is a pillar of collective political identity. In countries otherwise as different as Egypt, Israel, Turkey, India, Indonesia, Poland, and many others, politics and religion are interconnected in ways that belie any simplified model of secular separation. Many such states, for example, appeal to religious tradition in making the law. They provide material or symbolic advantages to members of the majority religion, or they enforce conservative laws in matters of sexuality and the family. Are they ipso facto in breach of liberal legitimacy? Or is there a minimal secularism, separation between state and religion, that is required by liberal legitimacy? In my book, Liberalism, Religion, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2017, I argue that there is such a thing as a minimal secularism. Secularism, however, is a much more complex political idea than is commonly realized. I disaggregate the different strands of secularism, and I show how they relate to different dimensions of what we call, in the West, what we have come to call religion. So instead of asking the question, can secularism travel? Because this question invites ethnocentric answers, measuring how well non-Western countries fare in relation to a presumed model of Western secularism. So instead of asking that question, can secularism travel, I prefer to start somewhere else. I prefer to start from widely shared liberal democratic ideals and assume that these are not Western ideals. Human rights, freedom, equality, and democracy are universal aspirations. And I then ask how much and what kind of state separation from religion is required to secure these ideals. In brief, I extract the minimal secular core of liberal democracy. And this will allow us to see that it's a mistake to assume that liberal democracy requires a strict separation of state and religion on the French or the US model. There is a broader range of permissible secularisms. So my talk is in 4 parts. I put forward 4 liberal democratic ideals that underpin and justify minimal secularism: the justifiable state, the inclusive state, the limited state, and the sovereign democratic state. And each ideal picks out a different feature of disaggregated religion. Religion as non-accessible, religion as vulnerable, religion as comprehensive, and religion as theocratic. So what this genealogically minded conceptual exercise brings out, I hope, is that when particular instances of religion do not exhibit the relevant disaggregated feature, that is, when religious ideas, institutions, or practices are not inaccessible, vulnerable, comprehensive, or theocratic, then liberal states may permissibly establish, recognize, or endorse them. So once we disaggregate religion into these features, we can also disaggregate secularism. So the secular state, I argue, relates to 4 dimensions of religion in different ways, and therefore the liberal state is secular in 4 distinct senses. Part 1, the justifiable state. The justifiable state draws on the idea that state officials should only justify their actions by appeal to public, accessible reasons. This theory of public justification explains the widely shared intuition that state officials should not appeal to the authority of sacred texts or to personal revelation to justify exercising coercion on all. And this is not, I submit, simply because people disagree about whether such sources are authoritative or not. People, after all, reasonably disagree about many things, including ideals of the good and of justice. Instead, I suggest some reasons are problematic in public justification because they lack some epistemic quality, say they're not accessible to common reason. While recognizing the fact of pluralism, we can also say that certain considerations are more amenable to public justifiability than others because they do not require any special knowledge to be understood as reasons, although they can, of course, be inconclusive or non-persuasive reasons. So what are accessible reasons? What do I mean by accessible reasons? Such reasons sit in between intelligible reasons and shared reasons. Intelligible reasons can be understood only in relations to the specific doctrine or epistemic standards of the speaker. Shareable reasons are endorsed according to common standards. Accessible reasons are somewhere in between, so they're not necessarily endorsed as good reasons, but they can be understood and engaged with through processes of democratic deliberation. So accessibility articulates what citizens need to share in particular societies in order for public deliberation to be possible at all, while remaining indeterminate about the substantive content and outcome of public reasoning. Consider as an illustration two different types of reasons against laws allowing physician-assisted suicide in a pluralistic society characterized by all kinds of reasonable disagreement. The first reason would be that because life is a gift of God, no person has the right to put an end to it, even the person whose life it is. Second reason could be that because the sick and the dying are fragile and vulnerable, their conscious determination to die cannot be ascertained with full certainty, and their vulnerability may be easily exploited by others. So, on my view, only the latter reason is publicly accessible. So we might disagree as to whether this is a good or sufficient reason to justify a law, but this is a public democratic disagreement. Whereas no such disagreement is possible about the notion that life is a gift of God, which is intelligible but not accessible in my sense. Now, here's an objection. If I do not agree that a reason is sufficient to justify a law, does it matter that I understand it? I think it does, because it's important to provide citizens with accessible reasons, because these are the currency of democratic debate. Those citizens who are outvoted in a particular debate, say those who favor laws allowing assisted suicide in a society, those citizens can see that the reason motivating the law is a reason they can engage with and continue to criticize. So this way, even though they are outvoted, they are respected as democratic reasoners. So the first principle of minimal secularism can be stated as follows. When a reason is not generally accessible, it should not be appealed to by state officials to justify state coercion. Now, under my theory of minimal secularism, ordinary citizens, non-governmental organizations, civil society associations, etc., can contribute to democratic debate in any way they like. So the theory is much less restrictive than popular liberal views of public reason, which consider that religious arguments in public debate are always illegitimate. On my view, it is only state officials who have a duty of restraint, who should not appeal to the authority of sacred doctrines or to personal revelation to justify the legal coercion of all citizens. So accessibility articulates what citizens need to share in particular societies in order for public deliberation about the reasons for laws to be possible at all. Importantly, it is not the case that only religious ideas are inaccessible. nor is it the case that all religious ideas are inaccessible. The accessibility condition, then, does not rule out religious argument in public debate. It only rules out a subset of them, and only by public officials, those who are directly responsible for coercing us all. Part 2, the inclusive state. So the inclusive state draws on the idea that the state should not associate itself with one religious identity, lest it deny equal civic status to dissenters and non-members. Consider, for example, a state that formally establishes the dominant religion out of sound, accessible reasons, such as the need for social cohesion or historical continuity. So this state would meet my first criterion, accessibility, justifiability, but not the second, because if religious establishment entails that minority citizens are denied basic rights, then it fails to meet the second criterion, the democratic inclusiveness criterion. So no constitutional theocracy that fails to grant equal rights to minority citizens meets basic criteria of liberal legitimacy. Now, how about the more difficult case of merely symbolic establishment, where minority citizens have equal rights, but they do not benefit from the same level of symbolic recognition as members of the dominant religion? So I suggest here that symbolic religious establishment is wrong when it makes religious identity a component of civic identity, of what it means to be a citizen of that state, and thereby denies civic status to those who do not endorse that identity, who are then treated as second-class citizens. So what we have here is an expressive republican idea of equality, whereby equal civic status requires not simply a legal guarantee of equal rights and distributive fairness, but also appropriate expressive treatment as civic equals by state institutions. So why exactly is symbolic establishment of religion so suspect? It is so, I suggest, if and only if religious identity functions as a marker of social vulnerability and domination. This clearly has been the case in the Euro-Atlantic area, at least, where religion has provided one of the most enduring fault lines of social conflict and exclusion, one at least as salient as divisions of class, caste, race, and gender. The medieval expulsion of Jews, the persecution of heretics, the convulsions of the Reformation, the confessionalization of Western states, the marginalization of religious minorities throughout the 18th and 19th century, and then the colonial subjugation of non-Western religions, all testify to the exclusive dynamic of religious conflict. It is not therefore surprising that the struggle for the liberalization and democratization of Western states often took the form of their disestablishment. In the 19th century, Catholic, Jews, and Protestants fought for the disestablishment of majority religions in England, the US, and France in the name of equal citizenship. And today, this is exactly how US constitutional theorists interpret the non-establishment clause of the US Constitution as an inclusive framework of equal protection and fair inclusion of vulnerable and marginalized identities. On this view, non-establishment, the secular state, is the best framework for guaranteeing the equal civic status of members of religious minorities. So we have then a second principle of minimal secularism, which goes as follows: when a social identity is a marker of vulnerability and domination, it should not be endorsed and promoted by the state. So interestingly, the dimension of religion that this speaks out is different from the previous one. Here, religion has nothing to do with personal revelation or inaccessible beliefs or doctrines. It is rather structurally similar to other politically divisive or vulnerable identities, such as race, and sometimes culture or ethnic identity. So A liberal state must not be a Christian state or a Muslim state or a Hindu state, where and when such identities are, as they are in many states today, factors of political salience and social vulnerability. But in societies where religion is not a socially divisive, vulnerable identity, there is less ground for secular separation. Part 3, the limited state. The limited state draws on the idea that a liberal state should not enforce a comprehensive ethics of life on its citizens. Liberalism, from John Locke to John Rawls, relies on a distinctive view of the scope and limit of state authority and of the claims of personal independence against it. In line with John Stuart Mill's liberty principle, a liberal state is a state that leaves people live their lives as they see fit, unless they harm others, whereas most religions seek to regulate the intimate details of people's private lives. So the dimension of religion that this liberal value picks out is that of religion as comprehensive personal ethics that covers education, sexuality, eating codes, work, dress, and so forth. And in many societies, religious moralities have been coercively entrenched through state policies, codified in personal and family law, and backed by the social power of religious authorities. Many liberal rights were products of hard-won struggles against the authority of traditional religious groups to construct and preserve a sphere of individual liberty. Consider the range of liberal laws in the 19th and 20th centuries, such as laws about marriage and divorce, women's rights and sexuality, and contemporary conflicts about abortion and gay rights in Africa and South and North America. Yet religion is not only about the minute regulation of comprehensive personal ethics. Religious traditions also provide collective norms of social coordination and cooperation. Consider, for example, the practice of having shared days of rest on religious holidays. And these raise less acute threats to individual liberty. So not all religion can be a threat, but also not only religion can be a threat. Some secular conceptions of the good life can also be comprehensive, and the state should not enforce them either on grounds of respect for personal liberty. Part 4, the democratic state. Finally, it seems to me that a secular state has to be a democratic state. This is necessary because citizens profoundly disagree about the boundaries between personal and collective ethics, the public and the private, the right and the good. And the only legitimate way to solve these conflicts is via democracy. The standard liberal view expressed by John Locke is that the state should deal with civil interests and leave spiritual matters of the salvation of the soul to individuals. But who's to decide what pertains to the civil and what pertains to the spiritual? In today's controversies about church autonomy and anti-discrimination laws, the nature of personhood, the family, marriage, bioethics and education, general liberal principles do not generate uniquely determinate and conclusive solutions. These areas are marked by what philosophers call deep yet reasonable disagreements. And in such conflicts, the democratic state, not competing authorities such as religious authorities, only the state has final sovereign authority. So it is the collectively authorized democratic sovereign that decides where the boundary between the civil and the spiritual, between the this worldly and the other worldly, between the religious and the secular, where those boundaries lie. So secularism is radical, it seems to me, in precisely this. I think what's radical about liberalism's secularism is that it is democratic, that it locates its legitimacy in the will of the people, not in extra-political, divinely ordained or philosophically grounded authority. So this is the most radical challenge to religion posed by liberalism, I think. It's not that liberalism maintains an illegitimate wall of separation between state and religion. We have seen that this wall can be quite porous, depending on which dimension of religion we focus on and which dimension of legitimacy we privilege. No, what is radical about secularism is that it assumes democratic sovereignty. So within the bounds of basic liberal legitimacy and human rights, deep reasonable disagreements are to be solved democratically. And just to clarify here, democracy is of course not to be equated with majoritarian tyranny. It must provide for minority representation, separation of powers, and judicial review. So one important upshot of this is that the democratic conception of liberal legitimacy allows for more variation in permissible state-religion arrangements than both secular liberals and religiously minded liberals have assumed. In my view, there is a variety of permissible secularisms, and the paradigms of French laïcité or US separationism are not universal models, contrary to their self-image. So just as secularized majorities can impose their own conception of the boundary between state and religion, so can religious majorities, provided they honor the other three liberal principles of accessible justification, civic inclusiveness, and individual liberty. So in secularized societies, in Western Europe, for example, state law will naturally reflect and promote the non-religious ethics of the majority. For example, via the dismantling of structures of traditional family and marriage, and via the expanding reach of norms of human rights and non-discrimination. This is how it should be. But likewise, in societies where religious citizens are a majority, they can shape the public sphere of their societies to some extent, but only to some extent. So religious majorities can shape the state within the constraints of what I've called minimal liberal secularism. Beyond that, minimal secularism has no ambition to provide final substantive answers to key questions of political, public, private, and sexual morality. Thank you.
Cécile Laborde for forging this concept of minimal secularism and showing that there is secularism is a mechanism and not a value by itself. As a society, through its culture and power and other factors, should absolutely be design what kind of secularism should be adopted. The second, I will give it to Frederick Vandenberg. Frederick is a professor of sociology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and distinguished Max Weber Fellow at the University of Erfurt, Germany. He held a PhD from l'École des études en sciences sociales, my school. I think we were in the same time. Okay. He is a social theorist and proud member of RC16. He has published widely in English, French, and Portuguese on critical realism, hermeneutism, and other things. I give you the floor.
Lots of light here anyway, dear colleagues, dear friends, brothers and sisters. First of all, I want to thank Sari Hanafi for the invitation and the honor to present here in this presidential session, right on the first day, in the first session in the morning, on liberalism, the other, and religion. So thank you, Sari. I also want to thank all of you who, after an extra long travel to this side of the world, woke up early in the morning, this morning, to come here.
We have a problem of,
I am a social theorist and a card-carrying humanist, as an ethical and philosophical movement that emphasizes the dignity, agency, and autonomy of human beings, humanism initially emerged as a movement of emancipation from within Christianism. It's only later, during the Enlightenment, that it turned against religion to assume radical atheist positions. Nowadays, to distance myself from Enlightenment fundamentalism, I define myself as a post-secular humanist. The post-secular indicating that religion is not necessarily a problem. It can be part of the solution and can be fully integrated in what Rawls called well-ordered pluralist societies. In this paper, I want to make the case that sociology continues the venerable tradition of moral philosophy by its own means. I want to defend a sociology that does not close upon itself and its methodology, but opens up to philosophy, to moral philosophy, political philosophy, and the philosophy of history. I want to defend a self-reflexive sociology that is in dialogue with the studies, learns from them, but also contributes to overcome the hypercritique, which expresses itself in a paradoxical junction of messianism and negativism. If sociology is to remain relevant and contribute to the public discussion about the most urgent issues of our time, which I take to be the Anthropocene, artificial intelligence, cannibal capitalism, and the resurgence of authoritarianism. So if sociology is to remain relevant, it needs to take the forefront in the recomposition of philosophy, the social sciences, and the new humanities. I conceive of social theory as the space of articulation between the various disciplines of the social sciences and the new humanities, where the foundational issues of the sciences and the fundamental issues of society can be discussed and elaborated. You all know the standard story about the sociogenesis of sociology. Sociology emerged in the 19th century in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution as an autonomous science, differentiated from the economic and political sciences, to study the phase transition to modernity. This story is not wrong, we all tell it in our courses, but it is self-serving. If we want to overcome the disciplinary thinking and open the social sciences, to invoke the title of Immanuel Wallerstein's Gulbenkian report, we need to foreground the scientific revolution of the 18th century. For a long time, the sciences remained within the bosom of philosophy. The scientific revolution of the 16th century arose out of the conjunction of mathematic formalization and experiments in physics. It was followed by a second scientific revolution in the 18th century, when the discipline split off from philosophy. Natural philosophy gave way to physics, chemistry, and biology. Similarly, moral philosophy was replaced by a federation of disciplines: history, economics, sociology, political science, and anthropology. So moral philosophy was replaced by a federation of disciplines that make up the social sciences, the humanities for their part, or defined negatively, and encompass disciplines that are excluded from the natural and the social sciences. It is within this context of the differentiations of the sciences that sociology emerged in the 19th century in Europe, in the wake of the Humboldtian University Revolution in Germany under Bismarck, and the establishment of the Grande École in France under Napoleon. At the intersection of the German Geisteswissenschaften, the British moral sciences, which included political economy, and French political thought, it arose as an empirical offshoot of the philosophy of history. While the new disciplines are institutionalized as research sciences based on empirical data, they also continue the tradition of moral philosophy here in the broad ecumenic sense by their own means. One could easily make the case that the founding fathers of our disciplines, not just Marx, Weber and Durkheim, but I think we should also now include Parsons and Bourdieu, who, unlike us, were deeply steeped in philosophy and knew their classics, that they were fully aware of the moral dimensions of moral life, as well as of the normative presuppositions and implications of the discipline, of the new discipline. In spite of their declaration to the contrary, they knew only too well that the sociology they proposed was situated in a long tradition, and they were also taking explicit sides. Marx tried to combine Aristotle, Kant and Hegel in a revolutionary philosophy of history. Durkheim was knowingly fusing Aristotle and Kant in his science of morals, whereas Weber, brushing aside 2,000 years of moral philosophy with a sleight of hand, was sociologizing with a hammer in the Nietzschean tradition. Parsons, for his part, rejected utilitarian consequentialism and sought, through a synthesis of Kant and Christian ethics, to restore a common system of ultimate ends. While Bourdieu is suspicious of ethics and always looks for interest behind values, he continuously invoked practical reason and defended a radical version of John Rawls' theory of justice. In any case, without reference to their classics, I surmise our classics cannot be properly understood. To address ethical issues in society, contemporary moral philosophy makes a distinction between ideal and non-ideal theory as two complementary approaches. While so-called ideal theory seeks to formulate the principles that would govern a just and fair society in the abstract, non-ideal theory shifts its focus to the real world, with all its complexities, limitations, and imperfect situations. To sociologists, even non-ideal theory appears hopelessly idealist. Unlike moral philosophers, who enumerate virtues, articulate visions of the common good, and elaborate the principles of justice, sociologists tend to focus on the negative and the bad: racism, sexism, colonialism. They also denounce injustices, inequality, and exploitation, and uncover social pathologies such as alienation, disenchantment, and enemy, leaving the explicit justification of their critiques, norms, and utopias to philosophers. To make the transition from moral philosophy to moral sociology as a form of moral inquiry, as Bella said, one needs to bring philosophy back into the real world and investigate empirically how actors reason, think, evaluate, justify, and act morally in ordinary situations of action. This transition from the normative to the empirical is only possible if one does not oppose philosophy to sociology, but rather integrates them into something like a descriptive ethics. Sociologists need to study the normative prescriptions of philosophers in order to better describe the normative dimension of social life. The point of such a detour via philosophy is to prescribe more in order to describe better, and also conversely, to describe more in order to prescribe better and ground one's judgments in the critical sense of the actor, le sens critique des acteurs. In everyday life, actors evaluate, judge, criticize others, politicians, and society all the time. Once one starts paying attention to the role of philosophical arguments in ordinary situations of action, one will discover that actors are endowed with a critical sense and that they continuously use moral language to denounce injustices of all sorts. As Luc Boltanski says, quote, "It is enough to pay attention to hear the incessant rumors that bear testimony to the indignation, to the pain, and also to the inquietude triggered by the sentiment of injustice that manifests the capacity of persons to put into work their sense of equity." End of quote. To ground our critiques of injustices, social pathologies, and unhappiness, it is important to recover the moral dimension of social life. Every action, no matter how rational or emotional, routine or strategic, is surrounded by a normative horizon that provides the principles, ends, and values that define and direct it. Similarly, institutions, no matter how systemic, have an ideal foundation that shapes their organization and their goals and is instrumental in the coordination of the actions of its members. Even financial markets are embedded in a moral economy, and it is thanks to this moral infrastructure that its successes can be judged and criticized. If social change is possible, it is also because the normative structures that undergird the institutions, taken singly or jointly, vary over time. If social change is necessary, it is among other reasons because yesterday's ideal interests enter into conflict with today's material interests, or vice versa. When actors esteem that the existing social systems, institutions, and practices are not only in conflict with their material interests, but that they also betray their moral promises and undermine the existential aspirations for a good life, social change is imminent. The contemporary moral horizon is constituted by a variety of strands and strata of moral philosophy that are inherited from the past, yet propose scripts of possible lives in the future that are still active in the present. Within the Western tradition, and I have to apologize here, due to incompetence, I will have to forfeit any discussion about non-Western moral philosophies. In the Western tradition, thus, our moral intuition consists of a mixture of, 1, classical theological conceptions of eudaimonia, the good life, 2, ethics of love, care, and solicitude, and 3, modern deontological conceptions of justice. Drawing on Paul Ricoeur's incredible talent to compact complex materials in a memorable phrase, I would characterize today's moral horizon in terms of, quote, a visée of the good life, with and for others, in just institutions. I think one should add, by now, in a sustainable environment, though I am aware that this may well lead us beyond humanism and beyond modernity as well. Empirical research shows that most of the time, actors simultaneously call upon God, invoke virtues and values, support love and benevolence, appeal to moral norms, draw on conventions, and defend justice and human rights when they practice ethical reflection. As sociologists, we should be much more reflexive and attentive to the moral and political philosophies that undergird our own positionings. With the force of conviction, sociology should reaffirm its moral principles, its first principles, and promulgate a declaration of interdependence. To conclude my presentation, I therefore want to plead for a sociology of sociology that investigates the moral and political presuppositions of the discipline. As we all know, sociology is a product of modernity. Modernity is both a presupposition and an object of sociology, which means it's both transcendental and empirical. When sociology analyzes the transformations of the economy, technology, politics, culture, and subjectivity, even when it investigates the epochal transition to postmodernity, even then, modernity is and remains the eternal subject of sociology. When it complements the analysis of contemporary society with a critical diagnosis of the time, a Zeitdiagnose, as we say in good German. It endorses the normative principles of subjectivity, liberty, and solidarity on which modern societies are based. The mutual presupposition of the empirical object and the normative project makes the whole sociological discourse circular. If we know how to enter this hermeneutic circle, and as we know in hermeneutics, the circle is everything, if we know how to enter this hermeneutic circle, this circularity can be productive. It will show that notwithstanding the occasional skirmishes between liberalism and communitarianism and heated debates about the priority of the right over the good, sociologists actually subscribe to both. My contention is therefore that sociologists adhere to the liberal communitarian repertoire and do not repudiate the principles of modernity. Sometimes they veer more towards the communitarian pole of identity and authenticity, at other times towards the liberal pole of autonomy and justice. In their critique of injustices, discrimination and intersectionality, in their critique of social pathologies like alienation and anomie, they do not oppose redistribution to recognition, but presuppose and project a world in which everybody is recognized as equal and different. Such a world is a world in which resources are fairly distributed, and cultural identities, paradigmatically race, gender, and sex, but also religion, are recognized as valid, provided that they accept the ground rules of liberal democracy, as Cécile Laborde explained to us. In this perspective, social democracy and multiculturalism, the liberal welfare state and the deconstruction of race, gender, and sex mutually reinforce each other in a virtuous circle that configures our normative horizon. If that sounds utopian and nostalgic, and I'm aware that we've all become a little bit nostalgic of social democracy and multiculturalism, it is not because the normative principles of modernity have been invalidated, but because the rise of inequality and the resurgence of authoritarianism are fueling a vicious circle in which neoliberal capitalism and cultural illiberalism reinforce each other and destroy the world as we know it. Thanks for your attention.
I'm honored now to have Anna Halof. She's associate professor in sociology of Deakin University in Australia. She's a chief investigator of 2 Australian Research Council discovery projects on the world views of Generation Z Australians and on religious diversity in Australia. Anna is also the author of the Multi-Faith Movement, Global Risks and Cosmopolitan Solution. She will deliver a talk on religion, religious nationalism, and anti-cosmopolitan terror. Please, you have the floor, Anna.
Thank you, Sari, and the ISA for inviting me to be part of this panel. As we meet here in Naarm, I also pay my respect to the spirit of country and acknowledge the past and present Kulin Nation, Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung people as the sovereign people and cultural knowledge holders here. So, as a sociologist of religion in the land we now call Australia, my and my colleagues' decades of research has documented that this is a secular society inasmuch as it does not have an official state church, and that state institutions officially affirm religious pluralism, where no one religion should dominate. And yet, our studies also reveal that due to its settler colonial history, a Christian privilege permeates many spheres of Australian public life, including politics, education, and media, perpetuating a myth of a white Christian nation which was created by the 1901 Immigration Restriction Act, known as the White Australia Policy. This myth, what Ghassan Haj calls the White Australia fantasy, did not back then, and certainly does not now, reflect the reality of cultural and religious diversity of Australia. Australia has always been culturally, spiritually, and religiously diverse, beginning with First Nations knowledges and languages, and then with subsequent waves of migration from Asia and Europe, preceding the introduction of this racist 1901 Act. Indeed, as this Act and the myth of white Christian Australia was constructed, this Act and the myth of white Christian Australia was constructed in response to the large and growing numbers of Chinese and Japanese communities in the mining and pearling industries across the far north of Australia, something we know very little about actually in textbooks, say, that are taught in schools. These competing national identities, the myth versus the reality, continue to play out in Australian politics, where the Christian right still maintains a strong yet flailing influence. Our society is becoming less religious, more religiously diverse, and more spiritual. As the dominance of Christianity fades, the more vehement are efforts to maintain its privilege and restore its power by Christian and far-right movements. And similar trends can be observed globally. Religious nationalism and authoritarianism is disturbingly on the rise, given its capacity to inflict violence, both direct and structural, on so-called others. These others are cultural, religious, gender, and sexuality minorities, and also non-human life forms. While it is often argued that religion is misused by perpetrators of harms, scholarship on what Appleby calls the ambivalence of the sacred argues that most religions have certain qualities that predispose them to violence and peace building. Scholars such as Appleby, Juergensmeyer, Sampson, and Schmidt-Lukl, my colleagues and I, have documented how religious peace builders can play and have played a significant role in social justice and addressing inequality by providing frameworks of interdependence, love, and compassion. They can be, as Frederick says, part of the solution and can hold states and corporations accountable. However, at the same time, religious exceptionalism and exclusivism, the sense of having the one and only right way, access to the truth, and superiority over others, leads to inevitable conflicts between religious and non-religious groups and state and other actors. Doctrines of holy war, common to many religious traditions, justify violence when one's religion is perceived to be threatened. Numerous religious texts allocate a lower status to women and LGBTI+ people. The belief that religion is over and above the law has also resulted in devastating harms to children, women, trans, and gender and sexuality diverse peoples. Most prominent religious figures are men, and religious ideologies frequently assert man's dominion over all forms of life and nature. So despite predictions of secularization in modernity, the decline of the power and influence of religion over states and societies, there has been, as Sari showed us yesterday, a trend towards a strengthening of conservative religious, political and media alliances in many parts of the world in recent decades, and I add, with devastating results. A useful framework to understand this phenomena is the clash, not of civilizations, but between cosmopolitan and anti-cosmopolitan actors, building on the work here of sociologist Ulrich Beck. The mid to late 20th century was a cosmopolitan moment where there was a growing global appreciation for the need to respect both rights and diversity. This was acknowledged in global declarations and covenants and local laws and policies that protected minorities and multiple species from harms. However, these developments were not universally accepted, given that they undermined the power and privilege of conservative, including religious groups and institutions. This has resulted in an anti-cosmopolitan backlash and the rise of extremist religious movements and nationalisms, denouncing minority rights, liberalism and democracy, and calling for a return, often to heteronormative family values. So, for example, I first used the phrase anti-cosmopolitan terror in 2014 to describe Anders Breivik's horrendous 2011 attack in Norway. His anti-migration and anti-feminist manifesto cited anti-Muslim statements made by Australian conservative and political and religious leaders at the heart of our so-called Australian values debate. Brenton Tarrant's horrific 2019 mosque shooting in Christchurch and his manifesto were also inspired by Breivik and fueled by anti-migration views and white supremacism formed in Australia and Europe. In India, Narendra Modi's authoritarian Hindu nationalism has also resulted in rising anti-Muslim prejudices and violent clashes between those supporting Hindutva and those opposing it. Vladimir Putin has most ominously long positioned himself as the leader of the conservative world through unparalleled online propaganda. Putin's regime is founded on Russian and Russian Orthodox exceptionalism and a dangerous vision to restore Russia to its former glory. Putin and Patriarch Kirill are engaged in a brutal, horrific war in Ukraine and against the West, spreading hate and disinformation to destabilize democracy, while at the same time lending support to other anti-cosmopolitan leaders and far-right movements globally. Putin's terror is being strongly resisted by Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian people and their allies, and by anti-Putin and anti-war activists in Russia, such as Alexei Navalny and his supporters. So it is crucial to better understand the role of conservative, religious, political and media actors in propagating this populist anti-cosmopolitan terror and violence globally, and critical that we, as sociologists, alongside more progressive, small L, I have to say that in Australia, liberals, religious and non-religious peace builders, play a role in strongly condemning and countering it. Sociologists conduct research on social relationships and institutions, including issues pertaining to social equality and inequality. A plethora of sociological research internationally over many decades, such as Yuval Davis's work, has documented the harms caused by racism and discrimination against minorities and the importance of inclusion and belonging to individual and societal peace and well-being. Sociologists of religion have focused significant attention on documenting the negative effects of discrimination against religious minorities, yet have been comparably less engaged in exposing and preventing religious and spiritual harms. This is thankfully beginning to change with a rise of critical, feminist and decolonial theories being applied to studies of religion and religious movements. Given the broad acknowledgement the calls for religious freedom have shifted in recent years from a shield against hate and discrimination to a sword that justifies holding and expressing discriminatory views, it is vital that sociologists also be prepared to move to interrogating all forms of hate and harms related to religion, to move beyond antagonistic respect, to name and call out the intolerable. So finally, Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the vast majority of countries, including Australia, have ratified, clearly states that the freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health or morals, or to the fundamental rights and freedoms, of others. It is worth stressing this in current times to better uphold cosmopolitan liberal principles of respecting rights and diversity, and to apprehend direct and structural violence against all humans and more than humans globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, particularly to problematize this religious nationalism and in its relationship to cosmopolitism and liberalism. So our last speaker, I forgot to say that Cécile Laborde and Azmi Bshara, they recorded their talks, and unfortunately they're supposed to be with us for the Q&A, but both for health reason they were unable, as it was conceived before. So Azmi Bshara is an Arab researcher, one of the most prominent intellectuals in the Arab world. He published extensively on political thought, social theory, and philosophy. His Arabic publication includes Civil Society, a Critical Study, Religion and Secularism in Historical Context, 3 volumes, and Transition to Democracy and its Problematique, a Theoretical and Applied Comparative Studies in 2020. In the last few years, he translates some of his work into English. So I will be reading his paper. 2 thoughts on comprehensive liberalism, political liberalism, and ideology. The heated debate in academic circles, at least, over the difference between comprehensive liberalism and political liberalism eludes applied liberal thought in whatever come of the global such thinking takes place. My main argument here is simply and can be submissed as follows. In the context of struggle for liberal democracy, the categorization of liberalism into political and comprehensive is superfluous. The more meaningful classification is between political and unpolitical liberalism, whereby political liberalism is more comprehensive than the unpolitical one. In any case, if we examine Rawls' categorization carefully, we find that his political liberalism is built on liberal axioms. These constitute most of the values of comprehensive liberalism, except that it takes them not as a core values, but as epistemological givens. On the other hand, when comprehensive liberalism finds itself in power, it perforce becomes political liberalism. The latter is in practice akin to the political ideology, and in this sense, it is comprehensive. The political version of any doctrine has to become more comprehensive than the unpolitical one. The first thought, according to Rawls, philosophical branch of liberalism, political liberalism, is claimed to manage a pluralist state system and protects the right of citizens to live by, adhere to, and detach themselves from comprehensive doctrines comprehensive doctrines concerning the good life, given that these doctrines can be presented and defended with reasonable arguments. A political liberalism doesn't impose a liberal doctrine. It presumes that the overwhelming majority agrees on the constitutional principle from which it proceeds in practice. I have problem to, okay. Liberals in power are political liberal. Outside the government, they have the right to practice their liberal beliefs as they understand them, but they cannot run the state according to a comprehensive doctrinal liberalism, which per definition includes a stand on what constitutes the good life, because they would not, they would need the institutions of the state to impose it. The claim that comprehensive liberalism is more inclined to be imposed through the instruments of state coercion cannot be validated neither theoretically nor empirically. People who hold comprehensive liberal beliefs are, despite my reservation about this designation, the most likely to impose the use of state coercion to impose their beliefs. Their commitment to civil liberties and their firm convictions on restriction the power of the state prevent this. These liberals are the most averse to government intrusion into society and the most inclined to limited state intervention that could infringe upon individual liberties and the most eager to empower people to avail themselves of their freedoms. On the other hand, since political liberalism is conceived with running the state and has little meanings unless it is performing or at least actively striving for the position to perform this task, it needs constitutional safeguards from the volatility of majority rule in the democratic system. Moreover, the resolve of enable people to make sense of their freedom and practice their liberties led political liberals to not only accept but to demand social welfare policies, although they are supposed to be inclined towards small government to minimize the function of state. Is that not comprehensive? Take, for example, the recent populist tide sweeping across democratic societies where the illiberal right is taking advantage of democratic rules to push through legislation that contradicts political liberalism. Or take the spread of general mood hostile to the existence of constitutional guarantees for rights and liberties which guide the work of unelected bodies such as the Supreme Court. Liberals involved in politics will have to find answers to both social and political challenges. The crises stemming from the permanent tension between liberalism and democracy, i.e. between governance according to the liberal values and governance according to the will of the majority, have recurred with near regularity since these two aspects of liberal democracies converged in the 20th century. Ultimately, such crises are useful in that they enable the system to readjust in their wake, but only on the condition that state I need to go back. State institutions are solid and enjoy the needed legitimacy to protect the value of political liberalism, which has to become more comprehensive after every crisis. Moreover, contrary to Rawls' fears, a reading of conditions in liberal democratic countries could lead one to an antithetical conclusion, namely that it is political liberalism, not so-called comprehensive one, that needs to be enforced by the state, at least in time of the outburst of the above-mentioned crisis. While comprehensive liberalism could turn into a subculture and even a lifestyle based on certain values that middle classes choose to live by, to defend or not, or to observe with varying degrees of authenticity or hypocrisy. The trend of confining liberalism to living according to individuals' choice of the good life might find itself insulted from socio-political processes unfolding among broader segments of society. Take, for instance, the attempt to dictate the mores of political correctness up in society at large, so-called comprehensive liberals, are shocked by the populist tide and the growing influence of groups who resent such attempts as patronizing. Political liberalism is no more or less than liberalism in power, a liberalism that has been put to the test of governing or that aims to govern. In short, we mean liberalism involved in politics, defining it by the distinction of political form. Comprehensive misses the point. We should not underestimate the significance of philosophical discussions abound without moral and political philosophy and jurisprudence, about the dilemma faced by different liberal currents in government regarding the degree of state intervention in the economy and meanings of equality, whether there is such things as collective rights or whether only individual rights are valid. Advocates for collective rights are split between those who see them as derived from the individual rights to voluntary association and those who accept that group rights can be attributed to involuntary communities as well. The latter, in turn, are divided over the extent to which the rights of the group take precedence over the right of the individuals and over the protection of individual freedoms within the groups. Comprehensive or not, all these dilemmas are faced by liberals involved in politics and must be accounted for by them. The distinction in such debate has been published in hundreds of books and thousands of articles. I know no more comprehensive range of issues, and this is the challenge that faces liberalism in power or in politics in general. Do political liberal approaches differ in their strategies on these issues? They do. From this perspective, political liberalism is more comprehensive than comprehensive liberalism, as it deals with different aspects of life, world of the individual, the society, and the state, in addition to having to contend with the ambiguities of comprehensive liberalism regarding the relationship between values and practice. A second thought. The foregoing conclusion is consistent that other conclusions that may be reached from the perspective of living under authoritarian regimes where liberalism outside the power structures may still be classed as political liberalism. This is because it occasionally reveals itself through the demands of political opposition forces and individuals, or within the regime through proposals for a reform program aimed at broadening the scope of freedom of expression and civil liberties. At a social level, in these states, the doctrinal liberals' thought and lifestyle may clash with authoritarian practices, but they might simultaneously clash with other opposition doctrinal movements seeking to change the systems of government in order to be able to use the state to impose their creed or their perception of the good life. However, since the collapse of the communist regime in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, most of the world-running authoritarian regimes are no longer totalitarian ones that impose an all-embracing doctrine upon society and state institutions. Today, most of those regimes justify their existence with arguments based on the principle of sovereignty, national interests, matters of security and stability, and alleged people's cultural incompatibility with democracy and increasingly what they term the failure of liberalism in the West. Very few authoritarian regimes are obsessed with the individual's lifestyles in the same fashion as the Iranian theocracy. Latterly, their number decreased by one when Saudi Arabia became less authoritarian in social issues and more authoritarian in political sphere. All authoritarian regimes require a great degree of physical, symbolic, and psychological violence to secure their stability. Usually, there are some opposition circles that espouse comprehensive liberal doctrines. They must be marginal, but the authoritarian rulers use them to discourage change. An interesting development has occurred in this context. Rather than coming in comprehensive versus political form, liberalism has split into one that espouses political and civil liberties and anti-despotic principles, and another version solely focused on personal freedoms and lifestyles. I disagree here the neoliberals who confine liberalism to the economy, as I don't consider them liberal to begin with. So lifestyle liberals fear of the opposition of an opposition with political religious ideology may be greater than their discontent under the ruling regime. Hence, paradoxically, liberals of individual choice of lifestyles might find themselves more comfortable with some existing authoritarian regimes because even though the regime suppress political activism and civil liberties, they are not greatly concerned with the individual's personal freedoms outside of times of crisis when there is a need to cajole the public mood. Liberalism of this kind is more concerned with about conservative social cohesion and the load of social tradition than about regime suppression of civil and political liberties. When liberals in authoritarian state think politically, they may reach the conviction that they should postpone the struggle for personal freedom at the political level in favor of proposing a liberal program for a system of governance that promises political plurality open to adherence to diverse comprehensive doctrines and safeguards for the protection of civil rights and individuals' moral autonomy. But this can prove to be a form of self-deception. It is unrealistic and therefore unpolitical. Overthrowing the existing regime without waging a struggle for a core value of liberalism, at least at the level of political elites, could open the way to power for forces that are only committed to political pluralism for electoral purposes, not to protecting liberties or individual moral autonomy. So political liberalism is obligated to wage a more comprehensive struggle for values because the presence of political elites committed to political liberal principles, regardless of their doctrinal disagreements, is essential in the aftermath of the overthrow of a despotic regime. At such moment, the dominant popular culture, after decades of living under authoritarian rules, is unlikely to commit to something akin to a liberal constitution or overlapping consensus. Nor will civil and political liberties have taken root in public culture. Under these circumstances, the political culture of the political elite plays a vital role and could make a crucial difference. It is often said that liberalism is a normative theory. At the level of university courses and academic conferences, they may be true, but in social and political conflict, liberalism becomes an ideology. It is in this context that the quality of being comprehensive takes on meaning. Philosophical liberalism cannot be comprehensive in this sense. It is always abstract, even when it's complex enough to have developed a comprehensive normative theory. Conversely, ideology can be comprehensive, though not necessarily in the sense of a totalitarian or all-encompassing dogma. Rather, it is comprehensive in its embeddedness in society and in relating to various aspects of life. It thus becomes able to address the people by tying liberties to their concerns about social injustice, culture, sense of identities, and prevent its political program that has to include a variety of issues. When it departs the realm of philosophy to engage in the down-to-earth realities of political and social conflict, liberalism finds that it must be comprehensive because it is political. It must deal with the issues that are not the core concerns of liberal philosophy. Accordingly, liberals can call, for instance, for the individual and society liberation from tyranny without alienation to people by upsetting the foundations of a dominant culture, religious or else. They recognize that they must offer solutions for the poor, who will not understand a notion of political liberty that fails to address their economic plight. Meanwhile, liberals, for whom a progressive personal lifestyle is the core issues, can coexist with the secular authoritarian regime. They may find themselves in the same camp with neoliberals, whose liberalism is restricted to promoting market economy and who are ready to turn a blind eye to daily human rights abuse. Finally, to summarize the thesis of this intervention, political liberalisms are much more comprehensive than the unpolitical ones that come with their conceptions of the good life in tow, or should we say in good lifestyles.